Well, welcome back to another episode of The Compass. I'm here with Dr. Brad Robertson, and today we're talking about a very important topic, especially because of the time of the year it is. But we're talking about graduation and times of transition. And Dr. Brad, can you just begin to walk us through why this is such a significant time in any young person's life?
Sure. Yeah, it's good to catch up with you again, Tyler, and just kind of talk with folks a little bit about these sort of things. It's the time of year, obviously, we're all making plans, going to graduation ceremonies and celebrations, and all of those sort of things. And certainly here at our office, it's a fun time of year because we get to see lots and lots of kids that we've worked with for years and celebrate with them the transition of graduation and all that that means. And so, I think that's the fun part of this time of year is just to be able to enjoy and celebrate those transitions with kids and families.
Oh, I think so too. It's some of those best celebrations are getting to sort of see the wonder and the look of people's faces as they're stepping in their next phase. I think just having this conversation is interesting because I graduated the same time as your oldest son. We went to college together in the
Yeah.
beginning. And I think he ended up transferring, and I transferred too. But we at least did our first semester together, and so hearing you talk about this is kind of cool because I get to kind of feel your perspective of when he was making that transition in his own life and what's going on developmentally in an 18-year-old that is sort of stepping into adulthood. I don't know. What are
Yeah.
the good and bad things that can happen in those moments?
Yeah. I think it's, the celebration hopefully is a great time for everyone. But I do often when I'm talking about those things here at the office, I ground it as I always do in kind of normal developmental processes and, the adolescent developmental process, outlined by lots of different folks, but I still go back to the old kind of tried and true Ericksonian stages, which really just practically resonate with what I see clinically all the time. And so in adolescence, kids are beginning to find a deepening sense of identity versus role diffusion. So they're beginning to develop deeper and deeper sense of who I am. And there's a normal progression through adolescence of that being increasingly defined by peers, like early on in adolescence. So families may feel the pull away a little bit from the family influences on the teenager towards peer influences on the teenager. And that's a normal process. I think one of the things that I often talk to families about with that is I see in our modern culture, or certainly over the last 20 plus years, I think sometimes people overestimate how much teenagers pull away from families in that time. They sort of make it seem like it's normal for families or for teenagers to hate their families and all that, and it's not. I mean, that's not really normal
Should
or
never be
healthy.
normal, no matter what the stage
Right,
is in
right,
life.
exactly. It's not, but there is a exploring of identity in adolescence and exploring that with a bit more freedom and interaction with peers. And then as teenagers move towards the end of the teenage years and graduation in our culture, graduation from high school and that sort of thing really, signifies that transition. There is a distinct period that's called separation individuation. It's this point where the teenager does really separate and become their own individual. Our culture doesn't, I mean, we celebrate it with graduations. We don't probably ritualize it nearly as much as we used to, and as other cultures probably still do. Um, but that is the context, the developmental context of this time of year and graduation and celebrating that transition to uh, much more independence and those kinds of things. And again, when it goes well, it should be a wonderful celebration and a time to really ritualize, memorialize, if you will, put down markers that say, you have really done well. You are transitioning into independence, and we really do celebrate you.
Just as you're talking, I started to think about how you're saying we don't ritualize it as much. And I heard an interesting study today that was talking about millennials, and they said that millennials are like 6 years on average behind of sort of every normal marker. And I was wondering, as you're talking about this establishment of identity and stepping into a firm foundation on their own, if the issue of prolonged adolescence is somewhere wrapped in this, and do
Yeah.
people go off to college and that's good for them, or should they stay home? Like, how do all of these factors sort of play into that? Because I thought that was interesting statistic. I'm like thinking to myself, the millennials need to expedite some things.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It is really interesting from even from a neuroscience standpoint, because, and a lot of, there's increasing terminology now around transitional age or transitional age adults or that sort of thing. And there's some good neuroscience there that supports the idea that frontal lobe development, executive functioning, which executive functioning is sort of the neuropsychological component of frontal lobe development from a biological standpoint, but it's the ability to evaluate and problem solve and delay gratification and delay impulse control for bigger goals and all of that. And there's pretty good research that the brain is still very much in flux and developing well into the 20s. I mean, certainly in 24, 25. And so that's sort of, from a neuroscience standpoint, lends support to this idea of the transitional adult. But I think that there are also other significant cultural factors that are at work there where, I mean, were my grandparents' generation, were their frontal lobes more developed or less developed? I don't know if there's been really good research to kind of show that. Certainly when you grew up in a generation where you were out making a living for yourself or your family, or shipped off in World War II or whatever at 18.
I know. I instantly thought about, even today, third world countries around the globe, that there's young people that start working as adults when they're 13 or 14.
Oh yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so then it that kind of stuff, is interesting from a neuroscience perspective and from a developmental perspective, in that it's probably bidirectional. In other words, delayed frontal lobe development and delayed executive function development, impacts the delay that you were talking about with millennials. Mm-hmm. But the flip side of that is the prolonged adolescence, the fact that as a culture and as families, we don't really put a whole lot of pressure on our 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds to really be more responsible for their choices and the consequences of their choices, and have real expectations, weighty expectation, probably delays frontal lobe development in a very real neurobiological perspective. So, I think that there's both of those elements going on. And I think, we could wander down that path, but to get back on track that's all relevant, but I think to get back on track of celebrating graduation and that sort of thing at this point in a kid's life, in a teenager's life, it is celebrating real risk, real choices, a lot of the ritualized culture, cultural things. I mean, you go out, I mean, the hunter-gatherer societies, you go out into the woods and you survive on your own and you prove that you can, that you can do that and all that. Well, what is that about? I mean, it's real risk. And it's real having to deal with the consequences of your choices.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about it all the time. Probably 2 or 3 times this week, I have had this conversation with teenagers and adults, because in our modern society, it's a finger wag moment. Oh, you need to grow up. You need to deal with the consequences of your choices. You need to da 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 da. Like all the consequences of our choices are bad or something. But like growing up in an environment where you are nurtured to take real, meaningful risk and deal with the consequences of your choices in that environment, some of which are going to be fantastically great, like successful, and some of them aren't going to work out so good.
Yeah.
But you learn to deal with the consequences of your choices in a real environment of real risk. That's worth celebrating. Like that's graduation. That's worth celebrating. That's like, yeah, you've arrived. You're ready to step into the adult world and continue the journey of life, which will have, lots of ups and downs, lots of risks, lots of consequences of our choices. But you're ready to do that. And we celebrate you and we, honor you in that process.
I've noticed something about transition just personally in seasons where you've spent several years or whatever, and then you move to a new place. There's an aspect of grieving that takes place. And I didn't realize a way to articulate it until I did it a couple of times. But even though it's just like, man, I can't go to lunch with the person I'm used to calling whenever I'm bored and want to go to lunch with somebody. And, that Chinese restaurant that I usually order this thing from, I don't have access to now. And those are little things that we don't actually realize that we have to grieve when we make those transitions. And I think about going to college and leaving high school. It's like a new set of friends in a lot of ways and new protocols. And I think that's sometimes why it's so difficult. A lot of universities lose so many freshmen. It's because they're not well prepared at times, probably, to go through that grieving process of all of the routines that they're used to in their life.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's, dealing with the transitions and the loss. And to me, like that grieving process that you're talking about sort of goes back. Maybe I'm overemphasizing that idea of dealing with the consequences of our choices, but it just seems like such a central theme to me that like people sort of miss the core thread through that. It's like, if you choose to go to school at, in our area here, you choose to go to school at the local college at SEMO or one of the, and you live at home, that there's consequences of that choice.
Yeah.
And that may be okay for you. That may really work very well for you. If you choose to go, to New England, to, college out there, that's going to have real consequences. You're going to feel the loss and the separation from family and friends and new routines. And you're going to more fully have to grieve that and move forward. Now, of course, there may be some great friendships that develop, great, things that come from that. I have one young lady that I've worked with, off and on for several years that comes to mind. And I mean, that's, she's so cool in terms of that. I mean, she struggles at times with a little bit of anxiety, but she leans into the risk. She's learned how to lean into it and do in many ways exactly what you have done and what you were referring to. She recognized the grief, the anxiety, the fear early on in the transition, and then, learn how to lean into it and go off to college, all the way across the country, go to Europe and do some study abroad sorts of things. And again, that was real risk. That wasn't, it was, she felt the risk of that. She felt some of the fears of the anxiety, but has leaned into it and reaped the benefits also, made great friends, done tremendous, had experience and opportunities that would have never come if she hadn't taken those risks. And so, I mean, having to deal with that and grieve and deal with, I mean, I hate to use the cliche, I hate the word, but the whole fear of missing out, or the term fear of missing out and all that, but there is some reality to it for the millennial generation. I mean, it's like that, and it does tie into some of what we're talking about graduating and ritualizing the transition and all that. It's like, you can't do it all. I mean, nobody can, right? And you're going to miss out. You're going to go to, across the country, and you're going to miss out on some family things. You're going to stay here and connect with family more and miss out on opportunities if you would have went away. I mean, you can't do it all. And that's okay. That's the whole point of this stage of separation, individuation, and learning to deal with the consequences of our choices and embrace that and move forward.
I believe the millennials call it FOMO. That's the word that you don't like.
Yes.
I was thinking too, just about sometimes transitions can be abrupt and without notice. So it's one thing when it's a graduation and the next step, whether to college or career. And then it's another thing when something in that process or a transition happens spontaneously that you weren't expecting. Somebody gets sick, you didn't pass the class, you lost your scholarship, the relationship didn't work out. And that has to be a more difficult, I would think, transition, when the one that you didn't see coming.
Oh yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's difficult for lots of reasons. I think it's difficult for the young adult making the transition, or anybody that's dealing with any age is dealing with an unforeseen event that you didn't plan on that's causing a major life transition. But around the graduation and the transition from high school to college, I mean, to me, that's a real challenge for parents. And because, the parents, we want to celebrate, but our own fear gets in the way sometimes. And then if something happens and we're like, oh my gosh, my baby, he's, he didn't pass that class. Oh my God, and we see them grieving or hurting, and we want to, rush in. And so I think that's a part of this transition too, is learning how to, as parents, celebrate, learning how to offer support, but also learning the boundary of what I can do and what I can't do for my child. I mean, I can't, when those unforeseen things happen, is when it really brings all that into focus.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit of it when there's the tensions about, well, I want you to stay here. Well, no, I want to be as far away from here as I can possibly be, or, that sort of thing. Some of that comes out in those tensions. But it really comes out when something unforeseen happens, and as a parent that your young adult child is really hurting and struggling. And what do you do? How do you support? How do you let them struggle with the loss or the failure? I went through that. I mean, I went through that with my oldest. I mean, and I've done this for years, and it was a struggle. He was, you guys were friends and all that. And that first semester of college, he was he was playing music a lot and just wasn't real focused, sure what he wanted to do with college, and
We signed up for every intramural team.
yeah, yes. And so, it's like, I think he did lose his scholarship, and then he made the decision at one point that he just was going to like go to work at a factory, somewhere in there, got married and all of that. And I was just like, I mean, my daughter-in-law is wonderful. That was a really, really good decision on his part. I wasn't so sure about the dropping out and going to work at a factory at first, and so it was hard for me to, that was not, it was unforeseen on, to some extent, his part and definitely on my part. But I had to step back and I had to let it unfold, and I had to trust that he was going to deal with the consequences of his choices. Turned out great, by the way, in the end. At the time, didn't think it was going to, but turned out great. He learned a lot from his time working in the factory, and went on to back to school and is finishing up his PhD, and and so I mean, it's great, but at the time wasn't so sure.
Well, I think it's good to just recognize as a parent, and I've noticed just sometimes it feels like some parents, when their especially youngest kid leaves or graduates, like they don't know how to come back to themselves, and they a lot of times have lived so much through their kids, they've lost their own identity in the process.
Yes, definitely. And that's the flip side of the same coin, of what we're talking about, is the transition for parents, especially as they become the empty nesters and they, and all of that. It's a big transition. And you really have to, from a developmental standpoint, it's the flip side of the separation individuation thing. It's you as a parent, hopefully, over the last 18 to 20 years, you've maintained some of your own sense of identity apart from being a mother or a dad. You have some sense of your own identity, some sense of stability. Because if you've lost that, the transition to being an empty nester and all that's going to be really hard. And you have to step back and look at that. You have to realize, who you are, who you were before kids, who you are now, and what your life is going to look like. I mean, I'm several years into being an empty nester now, and I mean, we're still, so there are days that I think our kids and now grandkids take up more time than ever. So it's not like it's not necessarily like you're just all of a sudden you just never see your kids. But you do have to be able to recognize, I've got to move forward with my life. I've got to take care of my stuff and be me, and let my kids live their life and do their thing. And that's probably, I mean, we could spend another big bulk of time. I mean, but at least touch on it here a little bit to back up our conversation to that first part of like the whole separation, individuation, or the whole identity development stuff in adolescence. I mean, if that hasn't gone well from the beginning, if you're into that period of time and you've got that adolescent who is, just, can't wait to leave, and there's a lot of conflict and all of that, then the graduation phase is hard to celebrate, because the adolescent is sometimes in anger leaving, in anger saying, I am separating from you and I'm out of here and, never coming back, kind of, that kind of thing. And that happens. I think as a parent, like, how to prevent that is to 18 years of healthy, authoritative, nurturing, but firm parenting is how to prevent that. As you move into adolescence, how to prevent that is to is to progressively shift your role to more and more a support coach role, because you're gradually letting out the reins and giving the adolescent more and more opportunity to experience the consequences of their choices, good and bad. And I think the more you progressively move to that, the less there's going to be an angry, you know, throwing off the shackles of the parents kind of thing. It's like, well, you know, I've given, you know, as a parent, I've given the teenager more and more gradual responsibility for the consequences of their choices over time. And then when they get to that final transition out of the house and all that, we can celebrate it. So I think those are some things to, when it's not going well, keep in mind.
Yeah, and I was just thinking too, like what expectations does, if you think about an 18 to 21-year-old, have of their parent once they leave home? Because there's a level of familiarity and stability that I think they still want to see. And the reason I'm thinking about that is because what is the best practical things for the parent to begin to do to make sure that they do step into the right next phase of their life? Is it hobbies? Is it volunteering? Going back to school? Like what are those practical things? And then how much of that is too much of them to do to throw their young adult kind of in a swirl?
Yeah. Well, one of the most practical things that I talk about during this transition is money, finances, basically, because money becomes so much of what we're doing during this transition of boundary setting and transitioning to independence is very emotional, and there's so many different layers to decision making and boundaries around consequences, and how much do we guard our child from the consequences, how much do we let them, you know, and those things are more obscure, but money is concrete, you know, you can at least kind of concretely look at it. And so one of the very concrete ways that I talk about that is that parents need to have a plan for their money, because it's their money. It's not the young adult child's money. And they need to have a plan, and then they need to stick with the plan. You know, this is how much we're willing to support in concrete dollars. You know, we're willing to support for, you know, the first year of college, X amount of dollars a month, for the second year of college, X amount of dollars a month, you know, third year of college, X amount, and then be pretty concrete and stick with that. Or we did a percentage in a, you know, so what we did with our kids is we told them early on, we will take the same financial risks that you will take when it comes to, if you're, you know, if you're going to college and you've got some of those expenses, I'm not going to expect you to figure it all out immediately, but we're going to take the same financial risk that you're willing to take. In other words, you know, we'll pay 50% of whatever, you know, college expenses that you incur, but you have to come up with the rest. This is your career. This is, you know, whatever you choose to do. If you want to go to a technical school and go, you know, more quickly down a career path, which is a great option for kids these days, then, you know, we're going to cover a percentage of that. Part of why that's real practical is not only, I think, is it healthy when all of this is going well, but when it's not going well. One of the struggles that I do see a lot is the adolescent, young adult who's angrily demanding their independence, but also, you know, easily falling back into their parents' financial safety net. It's like, well, I want to be independent. Oh, by the way, I need money for, you know, my rent. Well, I want to be independent, but, oh, you know, I lost my job because I hadn't been going to work, and I, you know, or, oh, I want to be independent, and I got kicked out of my first semester of college, and I have all these expenses, and, well, you can't have it both ways. I mean, and so that's where I tell parents, you know, be really concrete. And here's what I'm willing to do. Here's what I'm not willing to do from a concrete money. So that's one very practical conversation that I have with lots of parents and young adult, transitional adult folks.
I think that's extremely helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah, very helpful. The one final question that is kind of rolling around my mind, and you may have some final talking points as well that you would like to add, but I just thought about the idea of another transition is marriage, and where
Yeah.
along that timeline have you seen it to be really healthy? Because that's actually a hot topic in our society, is several people advocating for as young as possible marriage, and then other people saying, hey, you really need to wait. And I'm thinking about it because my cousin's oldest son just got married this past weekend, and he's 20. His now wife is 19. That's a pretty young marriage.
Yeah.
And so where on that timeline, if any, is it totally independent? What do you see? And obviously this is a big cultural topic.
Yeah, it is. To ground it in transitions, it's really grounded in my mind in that separation individuation kind of thing, and hopefully you have two individuals that have really, I mean, as much as any of us do in our our late teens, early 20s, have a sense of their independent self, and that may be just fine. So I'm less concerned about a chronological age and more concerned about overall development. I mean, if they're fairly grounded in their core sense of self and they found somebody, then I think a earlier age can work. There are certainly a lot of potential pitfalls with that, if they're not really more, independent minded and have a deeper sense of self. And yeah, in some ways that might be an interesting topic in and of itself, because it's one of the things like that I see that I may not be able to fully explain, of how I see it relating to exactly the cultural phenomenon that you're discussing. But it is what I end up, anytime those questions come up, I end up kind of talking with young adults about is, I encourage them to avoid the crazy pitfalls of dating that our culture currently has out there, because the crazy pitfalls of dating that we currently have are these two extremes. The, Tinder one night stand hookup, like that's, oh, well, that's just normal. And that's just kind of what dating is. Or, we've went on 2 dates and now we're a monogamous committed couple. Like, oh, we're dating, we're, Facebook official or whatever, is the way to be official these days, I'm like, what? That neither one of those really are healthy or make sense. You got to kind of find some middle ground there of really being serious minded about the process of finding a long-term, healthy, loving, committed relationship, and that process takes time. That's how it goes back to transitions and transitional adult things, and how do we celebrate that, but really encourage young adults to really understand who they are, understand what makes them tick, understand, consequences of our choices. And that's a big one, when we marry or, make a committed relationship, that's a big one.
Yeah, I don't know if many that rank higher. Well, we've had a fantastic conversation and discussion today. Were there any other just final touch points you wanted to add on this? How to navigate graduation times of transition?
I think probably to wrap up, I would just come back to kind of what we started with. I mean, I do encourage families, teenagers to really have a lot of fun. I mean, celebrate, truly celebrate, enjoy and celebrate um, well, I say have a lot of fun, take it seriously, honor, celebrate, ritualize, memorialize, the accomplishments of the teenager transitioning into young adult life. Really, really honor them.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And thank you everybody for tuning in today for another episode of The Compass. If you're interested in talking to us more, you can call 573-334-7055 or visit us online, bradrobinsonmd.com.